Okay, so I'm just going to start with sort of an overview of, so here's kind of the plan for the rest of my first hour here. So I'll talk about and show some examples of visualization from different science domains and some stuff that we've done in our group at Argonne. Touch briefly on large-scale visualization resources, talk about data transformations and things to think about when you're doing visualization and how to sort of categorize the things you're going to do with your data. Talk a little bit about visualization tools and data formats. And then we'll spend a good portion looking at different types of data representations, or different things you can do with your data in order to try and get some meaning out of visual meaning out of the data. And then touch briefly on a few things for doing production visualization. So here's a few examples. This is an example of arterial blood flow. So I work with a group from Brown University that's looking at blood flow, especially in particular blood flow in the brain, and they're interested in doing studying the effects of large-scale flow patterns on the large-scale flow patterns and how they influence small-scale blood flow activity events that could cause, for instance, in this case, they have they're looking at aneurysms in the brain and how the blood flow can cause those aneurysms to rupture. And I'll talk a lot more detail about this project later this afternoon in the success story stuff. This is an example of climate visualization. So basically, the team starts with they simulate climate. In particular, they start with historical data use that as their initial conditions, and then using their climate models that they've developed, they simulate over some period of time, and then they compare the results of the observed data with their simulated data. And here you can see off the Gulf of Mexico there's a red, in those red areas, formation of a hurricane, and also some tropical storm activity out in the Pacific, or in the Atlantic there. So we've also worked with some corporate partners as well. So this is an example of aerospace. We work with a team from General Electric Global Research that's doing jet nozzle noise simulation. So they're looking at ways to not only reduce the noise pollution, but by doing that, they'll also increase fuel efficiency. So they're looking at, this is an example of this jet nozzle. Some examples of different materials science and molecular. So this is, the example on the left is a simulated data set. It's a nanoparticle data set. The other two were proteins that were structured at the advanced photon source. And I'll give an example a little bit later of some tools that you might use to do some stuff like the visualizations like this. There's an example of a cosmology data set that they're doing, basically evolution of the universe type simulations where they're simulating dark matter. Bright areas are where there's clusters of particles that are forming galaxies. And this is one type of visualization, volume rendering. I think Tom's going to talk a little bit more about the project that this data came from in his part of his talk later today. Another example of astrophysics, cosmology, and this is similar simulation by a different team. And what they were interested in doing is, in addition to just doing the evolution, they were comparing two different data sets. So they've normally this data set would look similar to this previous one, where you'd see these clusters of galaxies. But what we did in this simulation was they actually ran two different simulations that had the same initial conditions, but then they added additional physics to their computation. So they did one run without radiation and another one with, And so they're interested in looking at what the differences were, what the effects of adding that additional physics looked like. So this is a case where we took those two data sets and did some comparative analysis. This is a little bit of an evolution of what that was. And so basically, the color bar there shows where it's basically the yellow is where one of those simulations was dominant, and the red end is where it was dominant by the other. So a little bit about visualization resources. So you've been hearing a lot about Mira, I'm sure, and our high-performance computing resources. So these are the numbers that we have on Tukey, which is our visualization resource. And most HPC centers have a large-scale viz analysis resource that they generally use to couple with their compute resources. So this is not unique to Argonne, but most high-performance computing centers have a similar type setup. And so it's a 96-node compute resource that has, each node has 16 CPUs in it, and 2 high-end visualization graphics cards, lots of memory. And probably one of the most important features of it is that the file system is cross-mounted with the compute system. So one of the biggest bottlenecks is often, is writing data to disk and doing data I/O. And so when you're generating these large data sets, you don't want to have to move them around a lot, right? So having a resource a viz resource that sits close to the compute resource is often beneficial. And so we use it such that you can write data to disk from the compute resource and then read it off of disk using the viz resource. So you don't have to move data around. And like I said, the writing data to disk is often one of the biggest bottlenecks. So there's a lot of efforts going on now where we're looking at, not just at Argonne, but throughout the community, looking at doing visit analysis either in situ, so while the data is still in memory on the compute resource, so that you can do some analysis, potentially data reduction, so you're not writing as much data to disk. And also, we call co-processing, where you have a setup similar to what we have, where you have your high-end compute resource, and it's connected via high-speed bandwidth to a visualization resource, and you can move data very quickly between those two resources and leverage the viz resource for doing visualization and analysis, where you've moved the data out of memory from the compute machine, and it can continue on and progress on its simulation while the other resource is working on doing analysis and visualization, and also it can also then write data to disk while the big resource pushes forward. So a little bit now, trying to change gears a little bit and talk a little bit about data organization and different ways of sort of categorizing how you're going to do visualization. So breaking up, so one of the ways to think about visualization is you're transforming your data, right? And so we kind of think about different ways, categorizing how we're going to do those transformations. Think about structure and type. So the structure means, so basically we're changing the geometry or the geometric aspect of the data. So, translate, rotate, scaling the coordinates, but without changing the topology of the data, so how it's connected, or changing the attributes where you're transforming or creating new data attributes that you're simulating or that you're going to visualize. And then there's also topological, like for instance, if you're going to change from, say, particles to a structured grid or something like that. But that seldom happens without also changing the attributes. So we consider that a combined algorithm. And then the second category to think about is the type of data that you're dealing with. So for instance, scalars where it's just a single value, or vector where it's an array of values, tensor matrix, or some combination of those. So one of the things that we have to think about is, how we're going to decompose our data set. So this is similar not just for visualization, but also on the simulation side, right, where data, so for instance, if we're using a regular grid, where it's regularly spaced grid of cells, each cell holds a single value per variable, or if you have a vector or whatever. But it's going to be too big to fit in memory on one node, on one resource. So you need to think about ways of dividing it up, right? So one way is to just evenly distribute those across the process that you have, to divide up the data domain among the available processors. And then in order to ensure accuracy at the boundaries, you need a level of ghost cells. You're going to need to exchange those between cells. Of course, you need to do that all over. And then this is also, when we get to looking at really large data sets, they're often written this way too, organized and partitioned in similar ways, where you would have, say, if we divided up this grid into these subgrids, you would have each of these subgrids be written as a separate file, as opposed to writing one gargantuan file. And there's advantages and disadvantages of doing both ways. You need to find the right balance. So another way of breaking up the data domain is adaptive mesh refinement. So if you put increased detail in regions where things are happening more rapidly, so if you know that ahead of time, or you can detect that as the calculation proceeds, you can start refining in places where things are happening more quickly. And this can help you increase computational performance, because if, for instance, if we were to put this on a regular grid, you take up this top corner, it would take 64. You have to do 64 computations, save 64 different values. But if you know that they're going to come up with the same answer, you can replace that all that computation and storage and memory with a single value. Again, that results in smaller data sets, enables you to do spread the computation out. So this is an example of a place where you might want to do that. This is a 2D visualization of an Xray burst happening on the surface of a star. So you can see the top 80% of this is atmosphere, and so it all has the same value. So you don't need to do it on a very fine grain resolution. So here now there's the detonation down in this lower corner. You can see some detail starting to form at the front burning edge. And so you're going to want to put more computation and make the grid more resolved and finer grain in those regions. And as it progresses, obviously that's going to spread out more. And then eventually you're going to get to the point, potentially, some calculations don't lend themselves well, where it's fast changing all over the place. But even in those, like for instance in this case, you can start out with low refined regions for most of it. It'll enable you to progress faster and store less data early on in the simulation and get to the part where you're doing more computation and it's more complex. Another data decomposition scheme, for instance, for particle-based data. So there's a case where you're keeping track of individual particles. Each particle carries some information about itself as it moves through the domain. And so computationally, each process could be responsible for some number of particles, no matter where they are, where they're located in the domain. So one way of decomposing that is to, say this is the physical domain, spatial domain, divide those regions among the processors, and then have all of the particles within a particular region be calculated on a particular process, but then you could lead to situations where, like for instance, in the middle there's a whole lot of particles happening there, and then some of these lower ones don't have a lot going on. So you're going to have to consider how you balance those, right? So in this case, you may end up with the lower processes sitting idle for long periods of time while they're waiting for the other processes to complete. On the other hand, if you have some number of particles per process, and that process is responsible for those particles no matter where they physically are in the space, you have to consider that all those particles they're going to be influenced by other particles that are near them. So if those particles actually live on some remote process, there's going to be a lot of communication that has to happen. So you need to strike the balance between those. And so there's trade-offs for both of those, and you have to sort of think about the right way to. There's challenges in doing that kind of stuff. And then another thing that you can do by decomposing in this way is in terms of, so we actually do this for visualization in some of the examples we'll show later, where we take the particles and we project them onto that regular grid. So we'll essentially take all the particles within one region of that grid and do some averaging based on how many particles you have in a cell and what the density is in that, and other attributes of those particles, and come up with some sort of averaging to essentially represent the space based on the number of particles that are in it. So this is one example of, I mentioned in situ analysis and data reduction earlier, where they're interested in this turbulence simulation. There's this white isosurface there, and they know ahead of time what the value of this surface of interest is. So as part of their simulation, on the simulation side, they can calculate what this isosurface is, and then when they go to save the data, they can do some compression on it and do it more aggressively, where they're saving more resolution the closer they are to that surface of interest, and then the further you get away from that, you can do more compression on it. And so if you have some data loss in regions further away from that surface, that's the important part, you're not really losing as much. So by doing that, this particular example, they were able to compress by 20 to 30 times while retaining full fidelity in the vicinity near this isosurface. So there's all sorts of tools for doing this kind of stuff, for doing visualization. We mentioned Visit and ParaView, which we'll hear more about a little bit later. Insight is a commercial product that has similar. These are general purpose visualization applications that enable you to do. It's not domain specific, so it enables you to do look at data from a wide variety of domains and apply a lot of different filtering and other algorithms to them. There's a number of domain specific. These are just an example of a few that are this VMD, PyMol, and RasMol are all molecular dynamics type visualization tools. There's different APIs, VTK, the visualization toolkit, used for visualization, ITK, which is the related library for doing segmentation and registration. There's a number that take advantage of leveraging hardware acceleration on the GPU. So we have a volume rendering library called VL3, and I'll touch a little bit more on volume rendering coming up, but I won't really go into details of our particular library of it, but know that there's some out there that leverage, and other tools that leverage the GPU. Environments for doing analysis like MATLAB and R. I mentioned this GNU Plot and ImageMagick are other utilities for manipulating data and images. And some workflow tools, VizTrails is a sort of an interesting tool for helping you to maintain provenance. So you can do, so you can keep track of how you got to a particular place in your visualization. So often you'll try something and say, okay, this is sort of right, but what if I just want to change one little thing? You can kind of backtrack and change something. Oh, well, that's not quite right either. Maybe it was closer the first time. And so it's a tool for enabling you to sort of keep track and keep, trails of your visualization so that you can keep track of those things and help you to reproduce in places where, that's appropriate. So, like I said, visit and pair view we'll hear more about, but just sort of the high-level view of them. They're both general-purpose Viz applications. They're primarily GUI-based, so you can they're interactive applications. They're both scriptable, so you can write scripts for doing batch visualization. In fact, that's one of the ways that I generally use these tools a lot. Is I'll use the GUI-based interaction stuff to set up my environment, load in a data set, figure out the views I want, set the different filters, and then I can take that state from that and then write a script based on that, and then apply that to a series of time steps to do a visualization of do an animation based on the things that I figured out using the interactive GUI. They're both extendable, so you can write your own, for example, data readers, or other filters that you can plug into them. They're both largely built on top of VTK, which is a programming environment API. So it has maybe some additional capabilities that are not as easily accessible through the other tools, because the other tools, like I said, are GUI-based. So that the VTK enables you to gives you a little bit more finer control, but it requires more expertise. So we end up essentially building custom applications, or potentially, like I said, using it to write, to extend, write a plugin or a reader or filter for one of those other applications. So typically the data format, your data structures are typically optimized for your simulation, right? So that's often usually very different from what's required for doing visualization. So this is not by any means an exhaustive list, but in order to do visualization, the data does need to be massaged a little bit oftentimes. And so if your simulation writes data in one of these, or like I said, there's lots of other formats, then you're sort of ready to go. If it's not, if you don't natively use one of these formats, you could potentially modify your I/O routines where you would write it out in one of these formats, and there's plenty of reasons why you may or may not want to do that. Or you can do some post-processing where you convert it from your native, whatever your native format is, into one of these types of formats. Or you can develop a custom reader, and I'll talk a little bit about that again in the afternoon session, or later today. One of the other, along with the data formats, data wrangling, we kind of call it, is basically doing that conversion and getting data into a format that's usable by the visualization applications. And so HDF5 is a popular data format you may or may not be familiar with for writing out large data, scientific data sets. And so there's XDMF is this little XML wrapper that you can use to sort of wrap up. Basically, your data lives in your HDF data set, and you write a little XML wrapper that describes what that data looks like, and you can use that to load your data into one of these Viz applications. So it's great for structured grids, which I've used it for. There's support for unstructured grid data, although I don't have firsthand experience with that, but I'm told that works too. And again, I mentioned VTK. You could add it to your simulation code, or write utilities to do conversions for you. And the VTK has C++ and Python binding, so it's pretty accessible for doing writing little utilities that can convert data for you. So switch gears a little bit and talk more specifically about ways to represent your data. And Mike pointed me at this really great book recently called Data Points by Nathan Yao, and he talks about visual cues and different ways, different things to keep in mind when you're representing your data. And these are 9 of the most commonly used visual cues for representing data. So position, so where in space data is located relative to other data, how long shapes are, angles between vectors, direction. So if you have a vector, showing the slope of the vector, what direction something's moving. Using symbols and shapes as categories to distinguish different types of data. Area, so how much space, 2D space versus volume, how much 3D space something represents. And then color, intensity, and color hue. So those are some things to keep in mind when you're applying visualization techniques to your data. So talk now about different types of representations and try and tie these back into some of those visual cues and some of the categories that we talked about at the beginning. So volume rendering is a way of taking 2- and 3-dimensional data and turning it into a 2D image where basically you apply a transfer function where you map color and transparency to each value in the volume. And then you can assign different ranges of colors at different ranges of values. So for instance, in the two in the top row there where it's the little mouse and the partial skull, you assign colors based on, so for instance, you know that some range of values represents bone, some other range of values represents some other tissue or cartilage or whatever. And so you can assign different colors to those different ranges of data values. And so I'll talk a little bit more about sort of how that works. So there's lots of different methods for doing it. Most accurate is direct volume rendering, where you sample every single point in the volume and assign it a color and a transparency. And this can be very expensive. So there's others that you sacrifice accuracy for speed. Ray casting can be really highly accurate, and so essentially what you do is you cast a ray through the volume. You take samples along the way, and so for each of those samples, you look at the data value at that sample, and then you look it up in a lookup table like this bar across the center here. So in this image, we're looking at density values. So regions where the density is very low are colored blue. As the density increases, you move to yellow, orange, red. And then this white line that you see through there represents opacity. So places where that line is high, you're going to give that sample high opacity. Where it's low, it'll be more transparent. So you take all these samples along this ray and you add them all up for each pixel. So you do that across the whole volume. And again, because we're looking at doing really large data sets, you need to think about how can you parallelize this. So one way is to do domain decomposition, where you break up that volume among different processors, and you do that same process of taking samples along the ray within your chunk of the volume, and then each one sort of renders its own little chunk, and then they get composited together at the end for the final image. And so this is trying to tie this back into the categories you're looking at, doing this for primarily for scalar data. Glyphs are another type of data representation. So you use a 2 or 3 dimensional geometric object to represent some point of data. And generally the location is dictated by the coordinate, so where it's located on a 2D or 3D mesh. And then other attributes of the data dictate what the other attributes of the graphical entity. So for instance, the image in the upper right is a bunch of particles, and they're colored by their velocity. So the position is based on where the particle is located as it's moving through this tube. We're looking at this tube head on. And the velocity near the perimeter is slower, so those are colored blue. As you get closer to the center, the velocity is moving faster, and the red represents a higher velocity. Similarly, in the lower left, there's it's actually the same data set, but instead of just using the little spheres to represent each particle, we're using a little arrow. And so each of those arrows, it's first scaled by the magnitude, so what the magnitude of the velocity. So you can see the ones on the outside are very small, the ones near the center are larger, and the direction is a vector. It's dictated by the direction that the velocity is moving. And then in this one on the lower right, the particles are their color is dictated by the type of particle they are, or their state. So you take, again, sort of different attributes of the data and apply those to different attributes of the glyph. This is just a couple more examples of that. Visit and peer review are good tools for doing this. VTK, similar, but again, it requires more effort. GNU plot, I didn't mention a lot about, but it's more of a command line driven tool, and it's also good for that. It's good at more 2D and table type plots. And so, like this little line graph on the bottom, you see each of the vertices, all those the little shapes that are used for each point is considered a glyph. So you use that to help distinguish them from each other. Another data representation is contours, where basically you're looking at representing a constant value within a data set. So in a 2D data set, like the one in the center, that would be a line. In the 3D case, it's a surface. And again, we're looking visit and peer review, good at this. VTK, again, requires more effort, but it's also good at doing this. In terms of the colors here, so there's different ways of distinguishing, right? So in the top image, there's several different isosurfaces, and they're within this. This is actually the tail end of an airfoil, and they're looking at the turbulence that's happening past it. So there's isosurfaces of several different values, and they're colored by their value, as opposed to this one at the bottom where there's a single isosurface. It's much more complicated, but it's a single surface for a constant value of some quantity. I forget what that quantity is at the moment, but then the colors it's colored by a different quantity. So it's colored by if I'm remembering right, it's by vorticity. So you can sort of use a single surface to represent multiple different types of data associated with the single data set, right? So we're isosurfacing by one value, coloring by a different value. So cutting planes is another representation where basically you take a plane and slice it through the data set. So each of these is just a single slice through a 3D volume. Again, visit and pair view. VTK, all equally good at doing this. VMD, which is a molecular data visualization tool, has some similar capabilities for doing that for different types of formats. And then in addition to doing these cutting planes, you can also apply other filters or other algorithms to the resulting data. So in this, for instance, in the image on the left, we're also applying glyphs to points on the plane. So there's, in that representation, the cutting plane, the color of the plane represents I believe it's the velocity of flow in this region, and then there's glyphs on the surface of on that plane, and their scale and direction are determined by the scale and direction of the vector of the velocity. So it's another way of combining different types of representation into a single view. So Streamlines is another type of representation, and this is more for vector field data, and it needs connectivity on the mesh. So basically, it's showing the direction that an element would travel at any point in time. So you within a single time step, you trace up where a particle would go based on a vector field. And this is just a couple different examples of that. And again, visit, pair view, VTK, all good at producing this type of visualization. So molecular dynamics viz. So there's, as I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of domain-specific tools that you could look at for doing particular types of visualization. VMD is really good at, it's a molecular dynamics visualization tool. And so there's a lot of domain-specific representations. So for instance, you can find the backbone of an element of a molecule. You can set attributes by atom type, so you can color different atoms by different colors. There's different representations like the ball and stick, ribbon representation, et cetera. So VMD also has, it supports lots of different file formats, and you can use it for doing animation. Again, it's scriptable. One of the drawbacks is depending on how large your data set is, it's not parallel. I think it may be threaded, so you can run it on multiple threads, but you can't run it, like, for instance, distributed on a cluster. Visit and pair view also have a limited amount of support for these specific types of representations. Like I said, they're very good general purpose tools, but they, for some domain-specific things, they're a little bit more limited. And again, VTK, anything's possible if you try hard enough. GNU plot is another tool. Like I said, it's primarily command line driven, and it's really good for, it's a graphing utility. So looking at more statistical as opposed to like structured physical data sets. And so for doing things like histograms and different bar chart type stuff like that, it's really good. So obviously I don't expect you to read all of that, but so for doing annotation and stuff like that, so sort of switching gears now, for once you've actually done your visualization, you're looking at doing like producing an animation or sort of a finished product for, say, for a paper or for showing in those types of situations. Image magic is you might be familiar with convert tool. So this wasn't meant to scare you, but you're able to do a lot of different things with it. I mean, so you can reduce, if I take this and I reduce it to, okay, there's this little section that's doing some annotation and like pasting a second image on top and drawing a box around it, and then a couple of sections where it's adding some text. And so the result of all that is this image, which basically I started with the 4 separate images, and they're 4 separate color tables. And I mean, so I could have done each of those things in a separate step and have like 15 different commands to say, okay, first add this, next add that. But you can combine it all into one thing. So it was just sort of meant to show you that it's pretty powerful and you're able to do some pretty complicated things with it. And so I have a tendency to try and take the raw image without any annotation because it gives me more flexibility in terms of you can do more things with it. Actually, I don't know if I have an example of this animation. I have it somewhere. I don't know if I have it that I can load up quickly, but so in the previous one, this was basically just doing annotation and slapping images on and stuff. And here I use it for doing scale and fading. You can do levels of transparency and zooming, that kind of thing, combining multiple images into a single view. I have a feeling I'm going to end early here, so maybe I'll see if I can dig up this animation to show you an example of things that were used. So again, so for movie creation, visit in pair view, you can have it spit out an animation file for you. So you have a time series, or if you have, you can use both of them to create a path through your data. And you can have it spit out an animation, an AVI file, for example, or you can have them spit out the individual images. And again, I tend to do that because it gives me more flexibility. I can use those individual images. I can multi-purpose them, right? So I can use them, combine them to make an animation, take a single image and use it for, for a single image for a publication, for example, or whatever. And by using the image magic tools and other tools, you can combine those things in different ways and use the same visualization for different audiences or for different purposes. One of the things I found useful was I'll jump to this last bullet. FFmpeg is a tool for basically encoding the movie. So you have a stack of frames and you can use this simple little FFmpeg line command to combine them all and to encode them into a movie. But one of the things I found useful for was often I'd find myself with multiple different segments of a movie or of an animation where I do transitions from one thing to another, or I add some text in one area and then I change to a different view. And so in order to put those all into one movie, I'll create each of those segments is a different directory full of images, and then I'll write a little script that makes symbolical links to all of them in order, so that you can run a single FFmpeg command that says, take all these 4 directories of images and put them into one big movie. So I've learned the hard way. There's probably a way to do it right, but I thought you could say, here's a set of images with this format, here's another set of images. But the first time I tried that, it ended up copying the first ones on top of the second ones instead of putting them in the movie. And so that was a little painful. I had to go re-render the movie because I just overwrote a big section of them. So doing the symbolic link thing is an easy way of sequencing those. And then here's a few pointers for some more information about some of the stuff that I talked about, some of the stuff we'll hear about later. The Tukey guide, again, Tukey is our viz resource, and so there's some information on that page about some of the stuff I talked about, how to use some of the different tools. Visit and Pairview each have their own sort of user sites and wiki pages for that are good resources for information. There's the link to ImageMagick, which is also, like I said, pretty powerful for sort of tying some of this stuff together.